Okay, inshallah, this is on now, and inshallah, everybody can hear me okay. Just give me a couple of minutes just to double check that it's working fine. Okay. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على عبد الله ورسوله نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. So welcome back to our weekly live stream that we're doing through Newcastle Central Mosque, Masjid Tawheed, and we're trying to answer as many questions as possible, and those questions are submitted via a Google form which people have written their questions on. And usually on a Sunday kind of morning, I go download the form and I go through all of the questions that are on the form, and I try to prepare the answers for those questions. So we have a whole bunch of new questions, alhamdulillah, even with the repeated questions taken out. We have quite a lot, about 34 questions that we're hoping to get through, inshallah ta'ala. The first question is, can we consume foods with white or red wine vinegar or spirit vinegar in them? This is a very, very good question, and it's a question which we're going to have to take a little bit of time to really understand. So first of all, there are there is an issue we can start with which will make this easier to understand. First of all, we need to understand that every kind of vinegar, goes through a phase of being alcohol. Every single vinegar goes through a phase of being alcohol. So that in itself is not the issue of it. And there is no difference of opinion among the scholars of the permissibility of vinegar in general, because of the statement of the Prophet ﷺ, what a good condiment vinegar is. And the hadith of Jabir in Sahih Muslim. So the issue of vinegar itself is not the problem. So what is the problem? The problem is whether, or let's separate into two processes here. One is that you take some fruit or fruit juice or grains or whatever, and you turn them into vinegar. And I don't know of any disagreement among the scholars of the permissibility for this, even if it goes through a phase of being wine. For example, you take apples and you produce apple cider vinegar. Now, that in itself is not an issue, even though those apples will turn to cider and the cider will turn to vinegar. I don't know of any disagreement among the scholars for the permissibility of this. The problem is when you take wine or alcohol itself. You don't take apples and make apple cider vinegar. You take cider. You purchase cider. And with that purchased cider, you produce apple cider vinegar. This one, it depends on the way in which it is produced. So if it is produced naturally, in other words, there is some cider or some alcohol, and it is moved into the shade or into the sun or whatever, this is not so much of the issue. But the issue is when things are added to alcohol to make it into vinegar. When things are added into alcohol to make it into vinegar. So again, let's just be clear that every vinegar goes through a phase of being alcohol. That's not the problem. The problem is when you take alcohol itself and you convert that alcohol into vinegar. That's one issue. The next issue is, let's just presume that this has been done. Let's presume somebody took a bottle of red wine and turned it into vinegar by adding something into it, by putting into it some vinegar, or putting some onions into it, or putting something into that red wine that turns it into vinegar, like putting salt into it, or onions into it, or extra vinegar into it, and so on. This is something the scholars differed over, and the Hanbalis and the Shafi'is, they considered it to be haram, and the Hanafis and the Malikis considered it to be permissible. However, there is another further disagreement. If you actually receive that vinegar, and it's not you that put the onion in it and turned it into vinegar, someone else did it, is that vinegar haram for you or not? So I'm going to go back again to the beginning. So it's not an easy issue to understand. So first of all, we established that every vinegar goes through a process of being wine. Every vinegar. So that's not, if you're looking for a vinegar that was never had any alcohol in it, I don't think you can find one on the face of the earth except for synthetic vinegar, like as in vinegar that was produced in a laboratory from certain acids that is not really vinegar. So this is not the issue. The issue is purchasing alcohol or taking alcohol or finding alcohol and putting something in it to make it into vinegar, as opposed to taking the original produce the alcohol was made out of and making vinegar from it. So we gave an example as taking apples to make apple cider vinegar versus taking cider itself to make apple cider vinegar. Both of them go through the same process. The end result is the same. There's no difference in the end result. The difference is one of them you took apples and the apples became cider and the cider became vinegar. And the other one you took cider and it became vinegar. You took the alcohol directly. The next issue is, even if this is haram, there is a difference of opinion about whether it's still halal to eat, because the end result is exactly the same, as in what is the case about actually eating it. And there are a number of different views among the scholars. There are a view that it is haram, it's not allowed to eat it. And there's a view that as long as it doesn't intoxicate you, it's halal. And there's a view that if it was done by the people of the book, then it's halal. And if it wasn't done by a Muslim. So this is regarding the alcohol that was taken. Somebody took a bottle of wine and turned the bottle of wine into vinegar. There are different opinions. Some of the opinions say it's haram for you to eat it. Some of them say that it's halal for you to eat it as long as there's no alcohol, nothing intoxicating left in it. And another group said that if it was made into vinegar by someone who didn't believe that the wine was haram in the first place, it's halal for you to eat. In other words, the Christians and the non-Muslims that produce it from wine, it's not haram for a Muslim to eat the product of that, which is vinegar. Bearing all this in mind and complicating the issue even further is the names don't help, because the names don't distinguish whether it was made from the original fruit or whether it was made from the alcohol. In other words, there is no naming difference between apple cider vinegar made from apples and apple cider vinegar made from cider. There is absolutely no difference in the name. Red wine vinegar made from grapes and red wine vinegar made from wine. There is no difference in the name. However, there are some which appear to be more likely to be made from alcohol than others. So I'm answering this in a long way because it's not an easy question to answer. And actually but if you understand that there is, in reality, it's not as big of an issue as people make it. Number one, because the majority of the vinegar you see is not produced from alcohol. It's almost always produced from the fruit. That's the first thing. Secondly, even if it is produced from alcohol, there is a strong opinion among the scholars that it's permissible for a Muslim to eat it. It's just not permissible for a Muslim to make it. And thirdly, there is no easy way to tell the difference between the vinegar that has been produced from fruit and the vinegar that has been produced from alcohol, because there is no difference in naming convention usually. And that being said, I don't really see that there is any concern for a Muslim to have over the kind of vinegar that is in the ingredients of the products they have, because of those principles. Number one, it's not clear what it was made from. Number two, even if it was made from alcohol, it's not even clear that that's haram. And number three, that the original principle of food is that it's halal unless you have a proof that it's haram. And you don't really have any way to prove that this is haram. So what I believe is the correct answer here is that it's better to avoid those kinds of vinegar that are mostly or usually made from alcohol. Now, spirit vinegar isn't. So don't worry about spirit vinegar. It's a misnomer. Spirit vinegar is not typically made from alcohol. In fact, I might be right in saying that spirit vinegar is almost never made from alcohol, because it has to be double fermented. It has to be, in other words, it has to start from the original product and then go to vinegar. So spirit vinegar is not the problem. Red wine vinegar and white wine vinegar, this is more of a one that I would personally, I try to avoid it, because I do believe that in sometimes it's made from wine, but I wouldn't throw something out in my cupboard because I saw that it had red wine vinegar or white wine vinegar, because of this second issue, which is that even if it's been made from wine, that the stronger opinion is that it's not haram for the Muslim to eat, even if it's been made from wine. It's haram for them to make it from wine, but it's not haram for them to eat it if it was made by either Ahlul Kitab, or if it doesn't intoxicate a person, which these don't. So I wouldn't throw something out in my cupboard because it has a red wine vinegar or white wine vinegar inside of it. But I would try not to buy things that are made from vinegars that are usually made directly from alcohol, like red wine vinegar, white wine vinegar. I don't have any problem with apple cider vinegar because it's almost never made from cider. It's almost always made from apples. And the major brands usually say that they make it from apples, not from cider. And I don't really have a major issue with spirit vinegar, but I would avoid white wine or red wine vinegar out of preference. But if I saw it in my food, I wouldn't throw the food away or spit the food out, because it's not clear that it's haram. It's not even clear it was made in a way that it's haram. And then even if it was made in a way that's haram, it's not even clear that the food itself is haram. But I don't see any reason to throw the food out in that instance. And the issue is one in which the scholars differed considerably about, and therefore it is something that is not an easy issue to explain. But hopefully that explanation would have answered some of the questions that people have in a bit of a practical, or in the most practical way that I personally can answer, which is that I would advise people to avoid vinegars that are usually made from alcohol directly. And you can research the vinegar type and you can find out what is usually made directly from alcohol. And I would advise them to avoid them, but I wouldn't necessarily throw that food away if I ate something from it, because I don't believe that it is haram in of itself. Rather, the process of a Muslim making it from alcohol is what is prohibited, and Allah Azza wa Jalla knows best. Tayyib. Next question. What is the definition of free mixing? I thought this was an amazing question, because in reality, many times we hear something is forbidden, but if we don't know what that thing actually is, then it becomes very difficult for us to understand or understand how to avoid it. And that's why you have the hadith of Hudayfa radiallahu anhu, in which he said, كان الناس يسألون رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عن الخير وكنت أسأله عن الشر مخافة أن يدركني. He said the people used to ask the Messenger of Allah ﷺ about good, and I used to ask him about evil out of a fear it would happen to me. So if we don't understand the limits of what something which is haram, we don't understand what the limits of that thing is, it's very difficult for us to actually be able to take any steps to keep ourselves away from it. So what is free mixing istilahan, in the istilah of the Sharia, in the understanding of the Sharia? What is free mixing? So it is for men and women who are not maharim, not mahram to one another, to come together in a way that increases the bonds between them and removes the barriers between them. And it can also include them coming in a way close together, in a way where they would touch one another. But let's talk about the first one, because the one coming together in a close way where they are in physical contact, that is not very common. It's not that common. And I think it's more obvious. The prohibition in it is clearer than the prohibition in the first part, which is men and women, non-maharim, gathering together in a situation which removes some of the distance between them and the difficulty of communication between them, and increases the connection and the bond between them. So this is a broad definition, and I think it's a good definition because it really explains what the problem is. There are cases, of course, of need. Someone might say, and people often say, well, don't men and women walk around the Kaaba together? But reality is that the situation of walking around the Kaaba is one of need. Men and women going to the supermarket together is also one of need. But what you do in that situation, even that situation of need, is you try not to bring about close connections between people or bonds between people and remove barriers. And this is the key thing, is that the question was asked about women and men working in the same office together. But reality is men and women working in the same office together, it removes the boundaries and it increases the bonds. That's the reality of it. So you work together in an office with someone, you don't have any, you don't think that any boundaries are removed or any bonds are built. I think that this is not realistic. Realistically, men and women working in an office together, bonds are built and barriers are removed. And therefore, it counts as free mixing from the point of view of what is prohibited in the religion of Islam. Whereas going to the supermarket, me walking into the supermarket and there being a non-mahram woman who also walks into the supermarket at the same time, it's very unlikely that that's going to increase the bond of us two together or remove some of the boundaries that exist between us. To be honest, that woman doesn't notice me and I don't notice her. There's no connection there. But being together in the same office is men and women coming together in a way that removes boundaries between them and barriers between them and increases the bond between them. It doesn't mean that they commit zina. It doesn't mean that they necessarily fall in love with each other. That's not what is that's not the single thing which is prohibited. That's the end which is prohibited. That's the goal which is prohibited. That's the long-term thing which is prohibited. But it's not, what is prohibited is anything which reduces those boundaries and anything which increases those bonds. And that's why Allah Azza wa Jal said, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا, don't come close to zina, i.e. don't do anything which would even bring you nearby to it, or even close to it, or even set you on the path towards it. And that's from there you can take that principle of building bonds and removing barriers. Anything which removes a barrier and builds a bond takes you a step closer to what Allah has prohibited, and therefore falls under the prohibition, because that which leads to the haram is also haram. So anything which builds a bond or removes a boundary or a barrier that would otherwise have existed between those people naturally, then no doubt this is the free mixing which Allah Azza wa Jal has prohibited. And that also is an excellent definition, because if you look at, for example, the men and the women being in the masjid together in the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam took very strict steps to make sure that those boundaries were not removed and those bonds were not built. From the steps that he took is that the best row of the men is the first row, and the worst row of the men is the last row, and the best row of the women is the last row, and the worst row of the women is the first row. So he encouraged them to be as far away from each other as possible. Then he would not allow the men to leave until the women had already left, and he would not also Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam would take time before he turned around, and he would say, Allahumma anta salam wa minka salam tabarakta ya dhal jalali wal ikram. Then the women would start, they would have left, or they would be leaving before the men would stand up and leave. And the Prophet ﷺ said, let not one man be alone, or he said that no man is alone with a woman except that the shaitan is the third one of them. So all of these are evidences that show us that what is prohibited is any mixing of men and women which removes boundaries and barriers and which increases the bond between them. This is what is prohibited. And as for the mixing between men and women in which there is a need, then it's only allowed to the extent of that need where that need cannot be fulfilled any other way. So for example, we said about shopping. It's not practical to have a separate shop for men and separate shop for women in many cases. In some cases it might be, but usually it's not practical to have a separate shop for men and a separate shop for women. Therefore, we say that men and women can attend the same shop, but we must do it to the extent of the need and we must remove any of the danger there. So, for example, the women, they would walk in the side of the road. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said in authentic hadith, women have no right to the middle of the road, meaning that they have to stay on the side of the road and the men walk in the middle of the road. So he put steps in place to reduce the harm from the mixing between men and women in the place where there is a need, only to the extent of the need and to the extent that it can, and with all of the protection that can be put in place to stop that need from turning into something haram. So this is what you say about the likes of men and women making tawaf together around the Kaaba and so on, that there is a need for that. There is no really easy way to accomplish that separation. And therefore it should be done to the minimum needed and with the maximum amount of restraint and limitations possible. And that's the best that you can do in that situation. So this is hopefully explained a bit about what the mafhum or the ta'rif, the explanation or the definition of free mixing is in Islam and where the prohibition comes and some of the evidences for that in the Quran and in the Sunnah. The next question, I want to study in Medina uni, but how do I balance between the dunya and the deen so that when I come back to the UK, I'll have a career to fall back on? That's a very, very good question. It's an excellent question, and it's a question that is not an easy question to answer in reality. How when you go and study, and I'm not going to say Medina, let's just talk about generally. I want to go and study knowledge, seek knowledge, Islamic knowledge. But how do I then have a balance between the dunya and the deen? How do I find that balance? In reality, if you want to go and seek knowledge, the first thing is you have to be willing to sacrifice for that. And that's why from the famous sayings of the scholars of old is the saying, لا ينال العلم براحة الجسم, that you don't get knowledge by resting your body. You don't get knowledge by sitting at home. You don't get knowledge by, not sacrificing. You get knowledge by sacrificing, by suffering, by staying up, by, till your back hurts and your fingers hurt, your hands hurt from writing and your head hurts from trying to retain the information. And that's how you get knowledge. So you have, in a certain way, you have to be willing to sacrifice. But also, we still, وَلَا تَنْسَ نَصِيبَكَ مِنَ الدُّنْيَا, don't forget your portion of the dunya. So it is still sensible for a person to make a sensible plan as to how they are going to manage their matters of the dunya so they don't have to beg from people and put their hands out. I don't advise anyone to plan a career in anything related to Islam. And me personally, and I can only speak from my personal experience, Islam is beautiful and da'wah is a beautiful field to be in when you do it for the sake of Allah. And whenever it becomes your salary and it becomes your means of earning, it only brings complications and difficulties, except in very limited circumstances. Now, I'm not saying it's haram to earn an income from that, because sometimes you don't have a really easy choice. But I would say that shouldn't be your mentality. Your mentality shouldn't be, let me go and study so I can be employed as an imam. Let me go and study so I can be a speaker or a lecturer or a khatib or a teacher in the masjid. Instead, let me go and study so that I can remove ignorance from myself and other people. And that's why they asked Imam Ahmed about the intention for seeking knowledge, and he said, أن تنوي رفع جهل عن نفسك وعن غيرك, that you make an intention to remove ignorance from yourself and other people. That's what your intention should be. If it turns out in the end that you end up with a salary from it, alhamdulillah. If it turns out that you don't end up with a salary from it, alhamdulillah. But don't make that your goal or your aim, because it just brings hardship and difficulty. So try to look at something that you can use in the dunya to help you in the deen. Now, I, for example, can only speak about the fields I know. I work in, well, when I'm not doing my Islamic stuff, I work in IT. And that for me is a good field. I like that because it's possible to work remotely from home, and it's a nice field to work in. Generally, it's quite easy to find halal income, and they're not so strict about qualifications that you have to have like degree upon masters and doctorate and whatever in your dunya based field. If you can do the job, many companies will take you on. So alhamdulillah, like I personally, like I kept my IT skills as much as I could, just so that I could have something to do that didn't involve the deen. But somebody might be in some other field, but you look at your dunya based field as for something that will help you in your deen, not something that's going to force you into the haram, not a job that's going to make you earn haram income, and also not something that's going to make you busy. And I made this mistake personally when I came back from Medina. I took like a job that made me busy, wallah, and I really had good intention. I hope I had good intentions in it, but it just made me busy, wallah, and I got so busy, my da'wah suffered. So you need to have a job that is helpful to allow you to get on with your da'wah work. And I know many people. I even know, for example, people in the medical field who made sure in their contract that they get a Friday off so that they can use that for da'wah. It doesn't have to be that your job is like a part-time job or something, but just make sure that whatever you do in your dunya, you do it to serve your deen, and you choose your career to help you in your deen, and not a career that's going to take away from your deen, either through earning haram or either through your time, taking away your time. And there are many things, like, for example, I worked as a translator for a while, and it was a really good job for me in terms of my deen, because it was actually improving my Arabic. It was improving my reading of Arabic, books and things like that, because I was translating them. And also it was a means to earn money. So alhamdulillah, that was another good job in terms of, it was a dunya job, but it was helping me in my deen. So I would advise people to look for things like that. But you have to be willing to sacrifice. If you want to study, you have to be willing to sacrifice. Otherwise, like the scholars of old also said, if you give knowledge, all of you, it will give you back a little bit of it. And obviously, if you give knowledge like just 10% of your time, it's barely going to give you anything back. If you give knowledge 100% of your time, it will give you a tiny amount back. So ultimately, you have to be willing to make a sacrifice. But I would just be intelligent about what you choose in terms of your dunya. The next question: how do we apply quotes from the scholars in their proper context and apply them the way that they were intended? It's common for people to take them out of context and apply a fatwa intended for one situation to a different situation. Well, that's an excellent question. And I looked at this question, and to be honest, I actually looked at this question and I thought of answering this question in really by dividing people up into three broad categories. The first category are scholars. And even though that word is not very well defined, but we'll talk about scholars as in people who are qualified to give fatwa. Let's just use that for the sake of this answer. I'm not going to go into the definition of a scholar, and is a scholar mujtahid, and can you have a scholar who's not mujtahid, and we're not going to go into too much details here. I just want to talk about, we've got a scholar. We're going to put the scholar on the side, because the scholar doesn't really concern us, since the scholar is going to be able to quote other scholars and apply the quote in the way that is intended. The next category we have is the opposite, and that is we have the regular Muslim. We have the regular Muslim, who is a person who isn't able to understand how to apply those quotes in the way they were intended, or isn't able to give their own fatwa. And then the third category of people we have the student of knowledge, or the one who is kind of in the state of, sometimes we call him the muttabi', the one who is following what the scholars say, but has enough understanding of it to be able to choose between them and to be able to quote them accurately. So actually, really, as for the scholars, we're not worried about them because they know how to quote other scholars. And also the talib ilm, the student of knowledge, who is in a state of ittiba', where they are not giving out fatwas, but they have the ability to quote different fatwa and to choose the correct opinion among them, then also they should also be able to apply quotes from scholars in the proper context. As for people who are neither of those two, neither are they scholars who are giving fatwa, nor are they students of knowledge who are able to understand those fatwa, then those people should refer back to the people of knowledge when reading a fatwa and when applying that fatwa to themselves or advising other people about it. And that is based upon the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Ask the people of knowledge if you do not know. Now, as for people who divide people into two and they say you're either a scholar or you're either a mujtahid or you are a blind muqallid. Yani either you are a scholar giving fatwa or you are an ignorant person who doesn't know anything. Then this in reality is khilaf al-waqi'. It goes against reality. Reality doesn't work like that. In reality, people are of three types. There are those who are qualified to give the fatwa. There are those who are qualified to understand it, extract benefits, and apply it in a limited context. And there are those who are not qualified to do either. And I believe this is the best way to answer that question, because it helps you to understand that there are students of knowledge who are qualified to read those fatwa, to extract benefits from them, to share them with people, and in a very limited context to apply them in a limited context, i.e. when they are sure that the conditions apply and so on. And it's not necessary for the people who do that to be at a level of ijtihad, to be at a level where they are qualified to give their own fatwa. But I see this, to be honest, as being the strongest answer. As for the regular people who have no experience of either of those two things, neither are they qualified to give their fatwa, nor are they qualified to read and understand them, then those people, we're not going to say you should never read a collection of fatwa or you should never read a book of fatwa. I didn't see any of Ahlul Ilm say this. I didn't see any of the people of knowledge say this. But what we're going to say to them is, before you apply it, you should be careful and go back to the people of knowledge to make sure that this applies to you. And that answers the question really as to how does a person reach the ability to be this, this scholar. The reality is you don't just turn into it's not like a caterpillar and a butterfly, you don't just turn into a scholar overnight. There's a gradual process of getting more and more knowledgeable. As you reach closer and closer towards ijtihad, the more qualified you are to quote the scholars in the proper context and to apply it, the more knowledge you get. And it's a sliding scale rather than black and white. That's what I wanted to convey to you, and I hope that helped to answer the question. Can you elaborate regarding student loans in the UK, and if they are permissible, and career advice from an Islamic perspective? These questions were brilliant, by the way. I mean, I really, really enjoyed these questions. I thought they were fantastic, and I thought they were very well thought out. Jazakumullah khairan. So student loans in the UK, I don't believe are permissible. I'd spoken about that previously in many different videos and lectures. I don't believe those loans are permissible in the UK, and I don't agree with the opinion that they are not interest bearing. I believe they are interest bearing, and Allah knows best. In terms of career advice from an Islamic perspective, my advice, and I really hope people would take this on board, is my advice is really simple. Start backwards from your career. Don't go through step by step, only looking at where your next step is going to lead. For example, there's a student now in GCSE, let's say in year 9, and they say to I know we got people from all over the world on this live stream, so they're not really year 9. What age is people at year 9? 13, around 13 years old. So you have a 13-year-old kid who is being asked, what subjects do you want to take? And he says, okay, I'm going to take some languages. I'm going to take Arabic, and I'm going to take French, and I'm going to take this and that. And then they get to the next level when they're 17 and they get told, what do you want to take? And he says, well, I'm going to take, let me see, I'm going to take maths, and I'm going to take biology, and I'm going to take chemistry. And then he goes to university, say, what do you want to do? He says, well, I think it might be fun to do business. So he goes and does business studies. And then he graduates from university and says, okay, what job can I get? This is not what I recommend people to do. I recommend that you start backwards. Start with the job that you want, which is the ideal job, which is a halal job, which has a high chance of being halal. Now, I know any job can be haram, because ultimately any job you do could be done in a way that is haram. But look for a job which you think there's a high percentage chance of it being halal. For example, let me give you 2 examples. Let me give you the example of IT versus finance. In finance, what's the percentage chance of you getting a halal job? I would say, with no disrespect to the people who work in finance, your chance of getting a halal job is extremely low, because the vast majority of things you're going to do are going to be interest-based, involving interest, involving riba, gambling, haram in different ways or the other. Look at, for example, IT. Is it possible I could get qualified in IT and end up working in a bank? Of course it is. But what's the chance of getting a haram job versus getting a halal job? Generally, and I'm not saying, because IT is a wide field and you could be doing something specific and end up with very little options. But let's say you have a general qualification. Let's say you're a programmer, for example. The chance of you getting a halal job is way higher than your chance of you getting a haram job, generally speaking. And generally speaking, if one company is haram, you'll be able to apply for another one that is halal. But if you're qualified in most things relating to finance, that's probably not going to be the case. You're going to be finding most of the opportunities in front of you are haram, and only a few of them are halal. So that's what I would say, is that the better way is to start with the job and work backwards. And then you ask, okay, this is my ideal job. My ideal job is I want to be ... It's got a good salary. It's got a good prospects. Generally speaking, it's got a good chance of being halal. I want this kind of job. Now work backwards. What kind of qualification do you need for that job? Okay, I need certain industry qualifications. I need a certain degree. I need certain other qualifications. Okay, now to get that degree, what do I need? I need a certain type of, I need at least a maths A level, or at least I need 1 science in my A levels, or I need at least 3 Bs, or whatever it is. It does. You get my idea. You keep working backwards, and that way it's very easy for you to choose the right options in your education that will give you the biggest number of choices. It's even more intelligent if you don't limit it to one job, but you look at a wide variety of jobs and you find the common denominators in them. So you say like, okay, I would like to be either this or this or this. This requires any degree. This requires a degree in either maths or science. And this one requires a degree in, let's say, for example, it requires a degree in such and such subject. And you break all that down until you find, okay, what I'm going to do to give me the best chance of getting as many halal opportunities as possible is I'm going to go with this degree, because it will give me an opportunity for this job or this job or this job or this job. And the person goes through it like that, and they go backwards. Now, I know it's not possible for everyone. Some people already made their choices, but as much as possible, I would advise start at the job you want, or jobs you want, or potential jobs you want, and work backwards. So many people choose a degree at university because their dad did it, because they heard it's fun, because it sounded like a good degree to do, and they had no clue why they're doing it or what they're going to do afterwards. I would suggest that you should start at the back and work forwards. Okay, is Teespring permissible to use? It's a website that allows you to upload designs for t-shirts, hoodies, and you can host your own shop when someone purchases a t-shirt, etc. They produce it and they ship it. Does this fall into selling what you do not own, or is it like a partnership? I can't comment on the specific website that is mentioned because I'm not familiar with that. And I wouldn't like to comment on their terms and conditions without studying them. And I don't have time really to go through and study them right now. So what I will comment on is the general concept of dropshipping. And when might dropshipping be permissible and when might it be haram? So the concept of dropshipping, broadly speaking, is when you offer a product for sale, and that you don't have stock of that product. The stock is held usually with the manufacturer, although not always, sometimes with a warehouse, and they ship it directly to the customer and you arrange the sale. That's broadly speaking what drop shipping is. Now there are ways or examples in which this could be halal, and there are examples in which this could be haram. So I'm going to try to explain that to you in the best way that I can, how it could be halal and how it could be haram. So the first thing we need to understand is we need to understand as-salam, which is a sale of something which is I don't know whether I'm trying not to use the word non-specific because that's not quite the right word. So it's not a single item. And perhaps I can give you a better example. There's a better example than that. I sell, let's say, for example, I sell phones. And I say that I will source you, or even let's use t-shirts. I will source you a t-shirt in medium size, white color, with the following words printed on it. Am I selling a particular t-shirt that there is only one of them in the whole world? Or am I giving you something generic and describing it to you? So if I'm giving something generic and describing it to you, which is sometimes called selling by description, then this is something which could be permissible in Islam. So I sell an item like a t-shirt with a description, and I promise you that you will receive that item with the description we agreed upon, or you will be refunded. So this has to be very clearly described, and there needs to be an explicit guarantee if the description is different or the item cannot be delivered, that a refund is given. And the contract must describe everything possible about the object. So this is based upon the hadith of Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, that when the Prophet ﷺ came to Medina, people were paying 1, 2, or 3 years in advance for fruits. So he said, whoever makes this sale like this, let him do that with a known measure, a known weight, and a known time. And the hadith is in Bukhari and Muslim. So a known measure, a known weight, and a known time. So here we agree a time that this will come to you by this date, that it will look like this, and we describe all of the aspects of it, and we take the money from the customer and make it clear that if it doesn't come by that time, or it doesn't come with the exact description given, then the money is refunded. But the clear thing here is that it's not a unique item. And what I mean by that is, it's like, I agree that I will give you a kilogram of this kind of ajwa dates from Medina. You pay me in advance and you tell me that in 2 months' time, within 2 months' time, or at 2 months' time, you are going to give me a kilo of ajwa dates from Medina. And you describe all the details of the dates, the quality, the size, the average size, the weight, whatever it is. I'm not selling you a particular item that is unique. I'm selling you an item that can be sourced from many different, or can be many different items will fulfill that particular description. So that's one option. This is different from a person who when they sell something which is a specific characteristic. For example, I sell a t-shirt which was like, let's say it belonged to a famous person or something like that, and it has a value, it's like worth a lot of money, and there's only one of them or two of them or three of them in the world or whatever, and I decide to sell that. I can't sell that unless I actually own it. I can't sell that because this is a unique item. It's the same as selling a phone where I give the serial number. If I'm selling a phone, like I'm selling an iPhone, and I give you a particular phone, a picture of a particular phone, and I say, this phone I'm going to sell to you. I can't sell that via dropshipping, because now that phone is a specific item. It's unique. Yeah, there might be thousands of them in the world, but with that serial number, with that picture, there's only one. As for me saying, I will source you an iPhone, which was made in 2019, which will have this amount of memory, then this is possible. The second way that drop shipping could work is if you act as an agent or a broker for the factory. You act as an agent or a broker for the factory. So here you are acting as an agent or a broker. You're not actually the one who is selling the item, but you behave as a broker or an agent. You say, I am selling this on behalf of the factory. I'm taking a 10% cut or whatever, or a 5% cut, and I'm actually the broker or the agent that sells this on behalf of this manufacturing company. And while this isn't called drop shipping, strictly speaking, it could be it could be considered to be a type of drop shipping, or it could be a similar way of getting around this. And that is behaving as an agent on behalf of the factory. And so in this case, the agent receives a commission, and when the sale is concluded, he asks the owner of the product to ship it to the buyer. But here it has to be clear that he's acting as an agent. It must be clear that he's acting as an agent for the factory, and he's not pretending that he's the owner. He's saying, I'm not the owner, I'm an agent for the factory, and I sell on their behalf. So these are two ways, like a broker or an agent. These are two ways that a person, or with a salam, which is the idea of selling something which is not unique or not a specific unique item, and selling something with general specifications, with an agreed specification at an agreed time, an agreed price, then this is something which is also possible, and it might fall under drop shipping. So these are two ways that drop shipping could be permissible, but it does require looking at the small print, and it is important that a person makes very sure that they are fulfilling the conditions of either the salam sale, where they are selling something in advance with a general description, or selling by description, or they are acting as a true agent of the company and they're fulfilling the conditions of that. The next question. Some countries are not allowing to bury those who died because of COVID-19 and only allowing cremations. The authorities are giving the ashes to the family and burying them in the ground. Can you explain the Islamic view regarding this, please? So first of all, I think that specific situations in specific countries should really be dealt with by the people in those countries. And that's because we don't know the reality of what's going on. I can comment and say that such and such a thing, and I don't really have any understanding of what's happening in that country or what the options are. And also rumors can spread. Like, for example, it's easy to spread a rumor and people can say like, in the UK, they will not be burying the Muslims and stuff. But in reality, like, we need to understand the reality of what's happening in each country. So the UK, I know the reality of what's happening in the UK right now, and I can speak about that. But I can't really speak about the situation in another country where I don't understand what's happening and what's being allowed or not. Are there exceptions? Is it the case that they are allowing Muslims to make an exception to this? Or is it a case that they're doing it for everyone? And has it been proven to be the case? Or is it something that people are saying might happen or could happen? And so on. So I think that this issue should be taken back to the scholars in that particular country and the people of knowledge in that particular country. And it shouldn't be dealt with by somebody who doesn't really understand what the options are available to the Muslims in that particular place. What is the permissibility of taking pictures on phones? Well, I personally think that digital pictures don't fall under the ruling of the prohibited picture taking. If they are completely digital and they are not kept on permanent display, they are just taken and stored in the memory. And then when they are brought up out of the memory, they appear. And when they are cancelled out of the memory, they disappear. So I don't think these fall under the rulings of pictures. But if a person avoids it, well, if you avoid something like that, it's better, because some of the scholars considered it to be haram. And many of the scholars considered it to be haram. And some of them distinguish between pictures and videos and many other distinctions. But personally, whatever you can avoid. But I personally don't see a problem with digital things that are not kept. There is no permanence to them, and they are stored on a memory card or on a hard drive. As long as they're not on display, they're not printed out. And Allah Azza wa Jalla knows best. Okay, the next question is about the difference between investment and gambling. This is a very, very good question. And our basic principle in it could be taken from the ayah in which Allah Azza wa Jal said, وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَى. Allah made selling, trade, halal, and interest haram. Now I know that doesn't relate to gambling necessarily, but it does tell us that there is a difference. And many people might say, ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّهُمْ قَالُوا إِنَّمَا الْبَيْعُ مِثْلُ الرِّبَى. Many people, they say, what's the difference between buying and selling and interest? So they say there's no difference between buying and selling and interest, but Allah has made buying and selling halal and made interest haram. So there is a difference between investment, istithmar, and between gambling. There is a difference between those two things. And some people said investment is gambling because you don't know the future. But then in reality, that it's not knowing the future that makes gambling, if that makes sense. So let's start by asking ourselves, what makes gambling? What actually makes gambling into gambling? So gambling is something which is based completely on chance. It's not a trade. It's not a trade. You don't own anything from that company or have anything of any value. So here, the gambler doesn't understand what the outcome, or doesn't have knowledge of what the outcome will be. So in reality, they have only the knowledge of the odds, and when they put the money in the pot, they get nothing. They have nothing from it. And one person sometimes explained a different way. Some of the scholars, they explained it. They said that when it comes to gambling, it means that one of the two parties gains at the expense of the other. Some of them define gambling like that. They said it means that one of the two parties gains at the expense of the other. One of them gains everything and one of them loses everything. But in reality, investment is nothing like that. Investment is nothing like that. First of all, investment is not, we're not just randomly guessing like that. You are putting money into a business where you become an owner of that company. You have a percentage of that company's equipment and assets and debt and so on. But when you gamble, the only thing you have is hope. Meaning, I hope it's going to land on this square. As for people saying, but a professional gambler can trick the casino or play the odds or whatever, this is not something that Islam gives any consideration to. Islam doesn't give any consideration to the fact that somebody might have a skill in gambling or might be good at gambling or something like that. Because in reality, it isn't like investment. As we said, in investment, both of the parties can gain, and one of the parties doesn't gain at the expense of the other. And it's not something that is 100% chance. Rather, it's something that a person looked into and they put in some money and they thought about it and they invested, and when it became a trade, so they actually invested in a company and became an owner of a percentage of that company. And they had some idea of what they hoped the outcome to be, and so on and so forth. So there is a difference between these two things, and that should be clear to people who, and if you think about it in reality, the difference between investing in a company and between gambling. But are there some kinds of investment that can fall under gambling? Yes, there are some kinds of investment that can fall under gambling. And that's why some of the scholars, they described things like options, where you invest in option contracts. And they said that these are gambling, which are like these contracts that basically talk about the right to buy something at a certain price or the right to sell something at a certain price. So some of the scholars mentioned that this is a kind of gambling, for example. So there are some kinds of things which might be called investment, which are gambling, but the general concept of investment is not gambling. I hope I explained that in a suitable way that people can understand. I used to go to the masjid every day. But nowadays, I'm lazy to go to the masjid. What is your advice? How can I start going to the masjid again daily, inshallah ta'ala? So I think that there are a number of different parts to this advice. I think, first of all, laziness should be treated with dua and adhkar, and by a person striving against themselves and their desires. So it should be treated with adhkar, and it should be treated with dua, the adhkar of the morning, the evening, the adhkar before going to sleep, and dua, and trying to overcome the what is within a person's nafs, and working hard against the person, working hard against their nafs and their soul to be able to overcome its desires. Like Allah Azza wa Jal told us about the one who is fearful of standing before his Lord, وَنَهَى النَّفْسَ عَنِ الْهَوَى فَإِنَّ الْجَنَّةَ هِيَ الْمَأْوَى, that if this person prohibits their soul from their desires, then Jannah will be their final destination. So that's, I believe, how a person can start going to the masjid again. They need to just pick themselves out of it. They need to turn to Allah, do the adhkar after the prayer, before they go to sleep, after Fajr, after Asr, and they need to fight against themselves, just break the habit, go there, and once they've gone, inshallah, it will become back into a habit again. And they need to be patient and have sabr upon that habit, because when you start a habit, you need to keep it going regularly. And that's why it's narrated about Aisha radiallahu anha, that when she would start an action, she would stick to it. Next question, is it permissible to take a mortgage when I'm paying the same amount in rent? If it's not permissible, how else can I get on the property ladder? No, it's absolutely not permissible. And I mentioned the ayah, ذلك بأنهم قالوا إنما البيع مثل الربا وأحل الله البيع وحرم الربا. There are some people who say there's no difference between trade and interest. It's the same thing here. Someone says there's no difference between a mortgage and rent. They're the same amount of money. The difference is that Allah made one of them halal and one of them haram. That's the difference. It's not about one of them is 800 pounds and the other one is 800 pounds. It's the fact that Allah made one haram and one halal. That's the difference between them. It doesn't matter if the mortgage is 100 pounds and the rent is 1,000 pounds. Allah made one halal and one haram. That's the difference between them. As for getting on the property ladder, then this is not the concern that is going to be the concern about whether you get to Jannah or not. As do I own my own property or not? But if a person wants to look at owning their own property, there are a number of things that they can look at. They can look at borrowing in a halal way from their friends, from their family. They can look at if they know someone who has enough money to help them with it, and that person wants to enter into some kind of contract or permissible agreement to get that money to them. Or the person can look at ways to save up to start with a very small property and then to go to a bigger property and so on. And that's a bigger topic than we have time for today. But ultimately, it's not possible or it's not permissible for a person to equate between those two things. To say my mortgage would be 600 and my rent would be 800. What's the difference? The difference is that one of them is halal and one of them is haram. And the severity of interest is one of the greatest of the sins in Islam. And that's why Allah Azza wa Jal said, فَأْذَنُوا بِحَرْبٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ. If you take this interest or you pay this interest or you facilitate it, then take a message of war from Allah and His Prophet ﷺ. So it's a matter of Allah waging war against you. It's not a small issue. It's a very big issue. And it's not for someone to say, I need to get on the property ladder or I need to own my own property. At the end of the day, this is not a consideration of what gets you into Jannah or doesn't get you into Jannah. But what might put a person into Jahannam is having interest-based loans on their name, taking them, giving them, facilitating them, witnessing them, and so forth. So yes, it's difficult. All of us would much rather own a property than rent a property. I can speak about myself. I would much rather own a property than rent a property. But right now I'm renting a property because at the end of the day, that is what I can manage in the situation that I have. And I don't want to go down the route of something which Allah is waging war against the people who do it. But inshallah ta'ala, you try and you look at options and opportunities, and maybe if there's a cheap property and maybe it needs some renovation and maybe you can borrow some and save some, and you try and make it that way. But if you can't, then ultimately you keep on paying rent. At the end of the day, one is halal and one is haram. Do pregnant women have to make up their missed Ramadan fast? Yes, I think there is no doubt about that. There is an opinion, no doubt, that there is an opinion among some of the Salaf, rahimahumullah, that pregnant women only have to pay to feed a poor person. It's narrated from Abdullah ibn Abbas and it's narrated from others. But the evidence here is strongly in favor of the fact that the pregnant woman, she needs to make up the fasts. And I think the safest opinion, and the one that is the safer one, no doubt, is this. If the woman, she broke her fast because she was not feeling well, like she's, let's say, one day she has morning sickness and she's not feeling well, so she broke her fast. Then this woman, she only needs to make up the fast again and she doesn't need to do anything else. But if the reason why she broke her fast was out of a fear for her child, like she said, I feel fine, I don't feel unwell, I can fast. But because I'm scared about what will happen to my child, I'm going to break the fast. Then I think in this situation, the best option is for her to pay to feed a poor person and make up the fast, to do both. Pay to feed a poor person and make up the fast. So I'll recap that again. If she broke a fast because she felt unwell, then she can just make it up. Because she's exactly like the sick person who Allah Azza wa Jal said, فَعِدَّةٌ مِّنْ أَيَّامٍ أُخَرٍ. Let them make it up from other days. But if the reason she broke her fast is she felt fine, but she was scared for her child, like someone said, oh, your child might get sick, or your baby might not develop properly, and she had no reason except fear for her child, it's better that she should combine between feeding the poor person, and making up the fast. This is the safer option, and Allah knows best. If someone only fed a poor person and didn't make up the fast, is it enough? No, they have to go back and make those fasts up, and Allah knows best. Okay, there's one question that I was asked about Google AdSense or YouTube advertising, and I missed it. SubhanAllah, I actually didn't see that question, so I'm going to save that one for later because I didn't research it properly. They're asking about Google AdSense, and you can filter out certain adverts, like you don't want alcohol or gambling, but you may get adverts containing music and so on. And what's the ruling? I would need to look into that in a bit more detail. This next question says, I joined your short course on the Muslim family, and you say that a woman must obey her husband because he provides food and shelter, and she may not let anyone in the house who her husband may not like. But what is the case if she owns and pays for the house? Is it her right to decide who can and cannot enter? No, this is one of the rights that it's not the case that if she owns the house, she doesn't have to give the husband that right. Actually, Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar and likewise Al-Qurtubi and a group of the scholars, they mentioned that, like Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala, he said that the meaning of the house of her husband is the place where he lives, regardless of whether he owns it or not. And that's from Fath al-Bari. So the meaning of her husband's house is the place where her husband lives and not the house that her husband owns. So when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, وَلَا تَأْذَنُ فِي بَيْتِهِ وَهُوَ شَاهِدٌ إِلَّا بِإِذْنِهِ, that he doesn't enter, she doesn't allow people to enter into his house except with his permission. The meaning of this is the place where the husband lives and not the place the husband owns. And so there isn't a ruling here that says that it is if the wife owns the house, it's her right to decide who goes into it or not. The fact that she has a husband that stays in that house, that is sufficient for the rights of the husband in terms of who goes into the house and who doesn't. But there is another aspect of this question, which is the issue of withholding rights, the wife withholding rights from the husband and the husband withholding rights from the wife. And we said this is not really a way to solve marital problems, even if some of the scholars allowed it based on the statement of Allah, وَلَهُنَّ مِثْلُ الَّذِي عَلَيْهِنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, that they have rights that are similar to the rights that are over them in that which is good. It's not really a way to solve marital problems, and it's not an effective way of solving marital problems to basically for each of them to withhold the rights from the other until generally speaking, this is not a good way of solving marital problems, broadly speaking. Okay, if we make a mistake in action during the salah, we are taught to do the prostration of forgetfulness. But what about if we make a mistake in recitation? For example, we are in sujood and we say Subhana Rabbi al-Azim and not Subhana Rabbi al-A'la. And when we rise from sujood to go back, we realize we said the wrong thing. Okay, so this question, actually what it helps to do, and I would advise people to go back to the Bulugh al-Maram series, which is on Kalima UAE YouTube channel, Kalima UAE. In the Bulugh al-Maram series, we went over Sujood Al-Sahw in detail. So you can go there, you can click on the playlist, you can click on Bulugh al-Maram, you can go to the prostrations of forgetfulness, and we covered a lot of things in detail. But broadly speaking, prostrations for forgetfulness are useful when it comes to, broadly speaking, when it comes to the wajibat of the prayer. Now that means the prayer is divided into three things. It's divided into arkan, and it's divided into wajibat, and it's divided into sunan. So as for the arkan, they are the pillars of the prayer for which the prayer would not be valid without them. And they include things like sujood, and ruku', and standing and so on. And then there are wajibat, which are obligations of the prayer. And those are the things that you can make up for with Sujood Al-Sahw. And examples of the wajibat of the prayer would be saying Subhana Rabbi al-A'la, Subhana Rabbi al-Azim, and so on. The middle Tashahhud, the first Tashahhud, the middle one. These are examples of wajibat in the prayer. And these can be made up for by Sujood Al-Sahw. So yes, if a person didn't say Subhana Rabbi al-A'la in sujood and they forgot about that, then they can make up for that with prostrations at the end of the prayer. And if you go back to the videos we talked about in detail, what you can do and what you can't do, really went into a lot of detail in that video. Okay. This next question is a wife who is suffering from severe hair loss to use hair extensions in order to make up for the defect. As for a hair transplant, then there is no issue with this. As for the hair extensions, Shaykh ibn Uthaymeen, rahimahullah ta'ala, he said, with regard to using a wig in a case like what you have described, where the woman's hair has fallen out and there is no hope of it growing back, we say that there is nothing wrong with wearing a wig, because it's not being done to enhance beauty, rather it's being done to remove a defect. However, it's better that a woman, if she can get a hair transplant, is way better than a wig, because the wig, it still falls into that which has been made haram, even if she has an exception in this case because she has severe hair loss. But it would be better for her to get like the hair transplant than to get the wig or the extensions. But if the hair loss is severe and she has no other way, and she doesn't get the extensions which beautify her or add to her beauty, but just to make up for the hair loss that she's suffering from, then from the statement of Shaykh ibn Uthaymeen, it would appear that he said that is permissible. The next question. My concern about the reputation of scholars and imams who support and justify the bad actions of the rulers, Muslims standing at the rights of the Muslims in many countries in the Middle East and Asia, and how can I respect them despite contrary of the facts? They may give false examples of history to convince Muslims they never guide or advise the rulers towards justice. I think there's a lot of misconceptions in this question. The first thing is that we as Ahlul Sunnah, we have a very clear belief which was taught to us by the Prophet ﷺ about obedience to the ruler. And that is a fundamental belief of Ahlul Sunnah. And if anyone goes against that belief and they call for rebellion and they call for disobedience and they call for these kind of things, then in reality this is not from the belief of the people of the Sunnah. It's not what the Prophet ﷺ taught. And there are many ahadith in this regard, including the statement of the Prophet ﷺ, even if he beats your back and takes your wealth, hear and obey, and so on. And these ahadith are too many, more numerous than we need to mention about them. And of course, this is only a quick Q&A, so we don't have time to mention every single one. But broadly speaking, there are many ahadith in this regard. Now, there are a lot of also doubts and shubuhat and confusion around this issue. But what I would suggest a person to do is, we're not talking about justifying bad actions, because ultimately if an action is wrong in the sight of Allah, it's wrong. But what we see in this situation is there are many, many misconceptions. First of all, people judge actions without understanding why they were taken. So instantly they say this person is bad because he didn't join this war, or this person is bad because he didn't send money for this country, or this person is bad because he didn't do this or he didn't do that. In reality, that is not an easy judgment to make without having all of the facts to hand. That's the first thing. Secondly, even if we accept that the ruler did something wrong here, doing something wrong doesn't necessarily make you a disbeliever that takes you outside of Islam. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ commanded obeying the ruler that strikes your back and takes your wealth. Is striking the back halal? Is stealing someone's wealth halal? No, it's not halal. But he didn't, the Prophet ﷺ did not tell us to take our obedience away from those people without that. Furthermore, this idea that the scholars don't advise the rulers, this is also, again, problematic. I would ask the question, وَمَا يُدْرِيك? How do you know that? Did you sit with them? Did you spend time alone with them? Did you hear what they said to the ruler when they were with him in private? You don't have anything except dhann. You have only guessing about that, really. So you don't really know for sure what the situation is. So it's better not to guess. يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا اجْتَنِبُوا كَثِيرًا مِنَ الظَّنِّ إِنَّ بَعْضَ الظَّنِّ إِثْمٌ. O you who believe, keep away from a lot of suspicion. A lot of suspicion is sinful. So I would suggest that a person should not concern themselves too much with these kind of issues, and instead what they should do is they should ask Allah Azza wa Jal to rectify the situation of all of the Muslims, those who are ruled and those who are ruling. And they should concern themselves with seeking knowledge, and they should concern themselves with what is beneficial for the Muslims. And as for worrying about the rulers, in reality, I don't see that you're going to get that much benefit. A lot of times you're going to be guessing about things you don't know the reality of. A lot of times people fall into declaring people to be non-Muslim without having understanding of really what they've done. And a lot of times people end up speaking without knowledge and then end up blaming scholars that they don't know what those scholars said or what those scholars didn't say. And that's why it was said to Shaykh ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah ta'ala and others about this. And the Shaykh became upset with the people who asked the question. And he said, do you not think that we advise them? Do you not think that in our, like, what makes you know that we don't, what made you know that we don't advise people? And ultimately, anyone who says, well, if the scholars wanted good, they would have spoken out. This is really, I need to be honest, this is nothing more than Sawt al-Hamir, the sound of the braying of a donkey. This is not the sound of a person who is calling to knowledge. Because there are many cases in Al-Amr bil-Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar where speaking out is haram. And those cases are agreed upon among the Madhahib al-Arba'a, the four Madhahib and so on, where speaking out against the Munkar can be haram. And from the people who spoke about this, Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala and others, where they spoke about the fact that speaking out against the Munkar can be haram in certain circumstances. So again, this is all al-khawd, is all messing around in things that don't benefit and don't concern a person. Rather, a person shouldn't be suspicious of the people of knowledge, and the person should ask Allah to correct all of the Muslims, those who are being ruled and those who are ruling the Muslims, and ask them to correct them. And that doesn't mean we excuse something which is wrong, because ultimately, if something is wrong, then we accept that it's wrong in Islam and we do our best to change it. But if we don't have the authority to change it or the knowledge to change it, then all we can do is we can only dislike that thing in our heart. That's the minimum that we can do in the situation, depending on the situation and the ability that we have. Can I do Ruqya on warm water? That's an easy one. Yeah, I don't know any reason why you can't do Ruqya upon warm water. If I sit for a final Tashahhud and a doubt comes whether I prayed 3 or 4 rakaat, what should I do? Similarly, if I forget the first Tashahhud in the 4th raka'ah prayer and realize it towards the end or afterwards, what should I do? So if you don't know whether you prayed 3 raka'at or 4 raka'at, then what you should do is go with the lower number, build upon it, like as in pretend that you stick with the lower number. So if you don't know, did you pray 3 or did you pray 4, then go with 3 and continue on, and then make Sujood Al-Sahw, the prostration for forgetfulness, at the end of the prayer. And the person said, if I forget the first Tashahhud and realize it towards the end, don't repeat it. Just make Sujood Al-Sahw towards the end of the prayer. Make the prostration for forgetfulness. So here, both of these questions, you pray 3 or 4 rak'ah, go with the lower number, then make the prostration for forgetfulness. And if a person missed the first Tashahhud, then they don't catch up with it, they don't make up for it, they just make Sujood Al-Sahw, they make the prostration for forgetfulness. Did the Prophet ﷺ legislate a specific salah to ward off pandemics? No, he did not. We don't know any evidence for that. Is it obligatory to sit down when eating and drinking? It's not obligatory, but it's recommended for you to sit down when you eat or drink. You can stand sometimes, but it's not recommended to do it very often. And that's why some of the scholars, among them Ibn Qayyim rahimahullah ta'ala, and they mentioned this regarding the makruh, is that the makruh is something that if you do it sometimes, it doesn't hurt you. But if you do it every time, then it can be detrimental to you. It can cause harm to you. So it's better that you every now and again doesn't hurt, but don't make a habit of it. In terms of printed pictures being haram, what if the picture being printed doesn't show the face or eyes, but it shows the picture of a person with their back to the camera? Well, I think it's better you avoid it, to be honest with you. Some of the scholars said if it doesn't have a head, it's okay. Some of them said if it doesn't have a face. But I think it's better you just stay away from it completely. And if you have to do it, then do it without the head. I'm trying to memorize more surahs from the Quran, so I've printed them out on my wall in front of the prayer mat. When I'm praying, I recite from the printouts stuck on the wall. I don't think that's a good idea. I think it's fine for you to put them on the wall to learn from, but I don't think you should necessarily use those in your prayers. I've heard from some Muslims that the time for Isha prayer is 1 hour after Maghrib. However, I've seen from other apps and websites that Isha starts later than this. I've been praying Isha 1 hour after Maghrib so that I can sleep early and stay up after Fajr for the rest of the day. I don't think there's any evidence that there is a 1 hour gap between Isha and Maghrib. Rather, the Isha time starts when the Shafaq al-Ahmar, the red color from the sky, has gone away. This might be 1 hour, it might be 2 hours, might be 1 hour and a half, might be 1 hour and 20 minutes. There's no evidence to say that it's always 1 hour. No, I don't think there's any evidence in the Sunnah to say that it's 1 hour. Rather, it is however long it takes for the Shafaq al-Ahmar to disappear, and it's different in one place to another. So for Newcastle, where this question came from, I think the best timetable you follow is the Newcastle Central Mosque timetable. And the reason why I tell you to follow it is because this timetable was made in a very unique way. We had a brother in Newcastle who was very good with seeing the sun and the position of the sun and stuff like that. Like I even saw that brother correct the Qibla location just by looking at the sun. And he would come into someone's house and say, your Qibla is wrong, you need to move it like a little bit this way. And then when they would check with detail, like in a detailed way, they would find he was correct. He was very good at seeing these things. And he went out with other brothers and they really checked the timings of the salah, and they checked it in comparison to the prayer timetable, and they made adjustments. So I think one of the most accurate timetables you can use for Newcastle is the one that is used by Newcastle Central Masjid. That's on their website, and I guess it's linked on their Facebook page. I'm answering because that question came from Newcastle. Okay, can you explain Zuhd? We're getting to the end, inshallah, not long. Can you explain Zuhd? Many times I read stories of the Salaf about how poor and humble they were. Is this Zuhd? Should we live like this? Zuhd has nothing to do with being poor. Zuhd has nothing to do with being poor. The best definition of Zuhd is تَرْكُ مَا لَا يَنْفَعُ فِي الْآخِرَةِ. تَرْكُ مَا لَا يَنْفَعُ فِي الْآخِرَةِ. Or تَفْرِيغُ الْقَلْبِ مِنَ الدُّنْيَا. Two things. Leaving that which doesn't benefit you in the akhirah. That's one of the statements of one of the understandings of Zuhd, is to leave the things that don't benefit you in the akhirah. There's a lot of stuff in this dunya that we have and we buy and we enjoy, which really doesn't benefit us in the akhirah. It doesn't get us any closer to Allah, and it doesn't really help us at all. The more of that you leave, the closer you are towards Zuhd, towards abstaining from the dunya. Or it means emptying your heart of the dunya. And that's why the scholars, they say it has no relation to the amount of money that you have. You could have a lot of money, but your heart is not attached to it. And you could have very little money, but your heart is completely a slave to what little money you have. So this is what Zuhd is. Zuhd is getting your heart clean from the dunya. That your heart is not attached to it. I could have 1,000, I could have 1 million, but my heart should not be attached to it. It should just be used for the akhirah, whatever is going to bring me closer to Allah. If a nice bed is going to bring me closer to Allah, alhamdulillah, it's not haram for me to have it, but if it's not going to bring me closer to Allah, then get rid of the things that are not going to bring you closer to Allah. That's the essence of Zuhd. leaving the things that don't benefit you in the akhirah. And in reality, a lot of us have many things that don't benefit us in the akhirah. Many things that we buy, that we busy ourselves with, that we use our time on, and those things don't benefit us in the akhirah. They don't help us in the akhirah. So that's the reality of zuhd. Someone asking about being subscribed to things like Netflix, and that company might produce content that includes kufr. Is this assisting kufr? It's certainly haram. I don't know about whether it's assisting kufr, but it's certainly not praiseworthy to be contributing to a company that produces content that contains things that are completely in opposition to Islam. It's not praiseworthy. If one is genuinely unwell with nausea, can they combine prayers like when traveling? You can combine but not shorten. You can combine but not shorten. Next question, is it possible to get your lectures converted and available on Google Podcasts? I am looking at putting lectures on podcasts. I'm trying, but subhanAllah, we have so many things going on. We just have to give it some time to get up to the stage where we can get that process going. Right now, we struggle just with YouTube, but inshallah, we're working on it. Sometimes we find many Islamic speakers online who seem to be upon the correct understanding of the Salaf. They quote Quran, Sunnah, Salaf al-Salih, but we see them doing lectures or conferences with doubtful speakers or Ahl Bid'ah. This can be very confusing. What is the correct balanced approach to this without going to extremes? Well, that's a very beautiful question. I think a person should not rush. When it comes to a speaker doing something that is wrong, there are two situations. Number one, that this is their habit and their methodology and their norm. And you see that person always doing that thing. And it's their norm and their behavior that they do all the time. So this person, I think, is better you distance yourself from them. I'm not going to say, give you a ruling about them, because that's, each individual is an individual person. But I'm going to say that it's better you just distance yourself from someone who makes it their habit and their norm. As for the speaker who might sometimes make a mistake, then this should not take you away from that speaker if they made a mistake, because nobody is free from making mistakes. Nobody is free from falling into errors, slipping up sometimes, and making mistakes from time to time. At the end of the day, nobody is free from this. And also, it can be that there's a difference in ijtihad. For example, they might not believe the person they're sitting next to is from Ahl Bid'ah. You might believe they're from Ahl Bid'ah, they're people of innovation, but they might not believe that they're people of innovation. So you can't really hold them to account because you differ in whether that person is a good person or not, for example. But I think that generally a person shouldn't rush in this. They should take their time. They should find out the facts before they rush to just condemn somebody because they saw a picture of them. First of all, let them ask the person, let them find out the reality of it. And it's different, the person who makes it their habit and their norm, and the person who might fall into an occasional mistake. And also you have to bear in mind the differences in ijtihad as to whether this person is really allowed to participate in their conferences or not. Because, for example, I might participate in a conference with a particular organization. I don't think there's anything wrong with them, but other people think there is. So they can't hold me upon that. They can't make that ilzam upon me that I can't go and give a lecture with that organization because they say that in our opinion that organization is bad. But ultimately, you can't force that opinion upon someone else, and you can't hold them to be an innovator because if they don't if the difference between you is just that you see the issue differently. It goes back to the evidence and the dalil. But definitely there's a difference between somebody who does this as a habit and it's their norm, and somebody who makes an occasional mistake or an occasional slip. And I wouldn't rush to judge people or to make rulings upon people, but to find out the reality and the truth and to ask and be careful about it. That's better for a person than to rush and just jump with the mob and just, condemn a person without asking and finding out the reality of them. But if you feel unsure or uncertain, then it's no problem for you to distance yourself for a while. Maybe, inshallah, you can find an alternative speaker to listen to, but you don't have to necessarily write about that person or speak about that person. Instead, you might draw their attention to someone who is more knowledgeable, who can take this matter on for themselves and find out the reality of it. Okay, the last question that we have, very last question on the questions that were submitted. And it's the last one because it is getting, it's already reached Maghrib time, right? We've already reached Maghrib time. Okay, so last question. Can you explain the different madhab groups and the difference between them? So this is a big question, but I'm going to answer it in a little bit of a short way. Inshallah, I'm going to try to answer it as short as I possibly can. What are the different madhabs and what's the difference between them? So you have to understand that the madhabs didn't exist in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. They didn't exist in the time of the Sahaba. They didn't exist in the time immediately after the Sahaba either. They were formed much later than that. And that means that you can't make them a fundamental part of Islam. You can't make them you can't add into Islam something that wasn't there in the time of the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba and then oblige it or enforce it upon people. However, what the madhabs are good for is they provide a good structured curriculum for learning Islamic knowledge. And it's very hard to learn Islamic knowledge without a madhab. What I mean by that is knowledge of fiqh without a madhab, because it provides a structured curriculum and a set of principles and rules and verdicts which all match one another. And so it's like a good curriculum for learning fiqh from. But it's not the beginning and the end of Islam. As for the differences between them, then there are differences in usul and there are differences in the verdicts on individual masail. As for the differences in the principles, then there are many differences in principles, particularly between, for example, between the Hanafiya, between the Hanafis, and between the Jumhur, the majority from the Malikiyya and the Shafi'iyya, and the Hanabila, whose principles are relatively close together. And there are differences in individual issues and how they ruled upon them. But in reality, a madhab is a facilitator. It's there to make learning fiqh easy. That's what it's there to do. And for that purpose, it's very good and beneficial to follow it, to learn it, to study it, because it helps to make fiqh easy. But it's not the beginning and the end. It's a means to a goal, and it's not a goal in of itself. And it shouldn't be taken as an individual goal in of itself, nor should it be made obligatory upon every Muslim, because you can't make something obligatory upon the Muslims that was not made obligatory upon them by the Prophet ﷺ, nor was it made obligatory upon them by the Book of Allah. So you can't bring that and make that obligatory upon them after that. But what you can say is that it is a beneficial way of learning fiqh, and it's very hard to learn fiqh in a detailed way without learning it through the madhab. The majority of the scholars and people of knowledge attributed themselves to a madhab, and there is no harm in that as long as it doesn't reach an extreme. And an extreme could be where a person ignores the truth, ignores the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, ignores what Allah Azza wa Jal sent down in the Quran, and instead says, my Imam said, then there's no good in this. Like a Shafi'i mentioned that there is consensus among all of the people of knowledge that whoever the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ becomes clear to them, it's not allowed for them to leave it for the opinion of anyone, whoever they are. So I did my best to answer. I had a lot of questions, and we tried to answer all of them. It's now Maghrib time in Newcastle. Of course, everyone has different Maghrib time wherever they are, but it's Maghrib time here in Newcastle, so I'm going to stop right there. And as for the questions that came on the side, so generally speaking, people ask, some questions were for the Masjid, so I'm going to leave those inshallah. And the question regarding giving a talk every day in Ramadan, the best way, if you want to find out most of my talks in Ramadan that are every day, then I would go over to Al-Madrasatul Umariyah, because that's where I'm doing most of my work these days. So you can go to amauathome.com, amauathome.com. AMAUATHOME.com. And that's where you find most of my daily kind of work. And you can also find it on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Muhammad Tim. And inshallah, we'll be releasing things as much as we can. I'm not sure if we can do every day, but we try our very best, inshallah. We do our best what we can do, inshallah. So Jazakumullah khairan, and Jazakallah khairan to the Masjid and the Masjid administration for allowing us to host this live Q&A session. Inshallah, we'll have another one next week, and Allah knows best. Wassalatu wassalam ala nabina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Wa alaykum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to all the people who were giving salam in the comments there. Wa alaykum